Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 7 from Fortet, Beautiful Rewind. Okay then, so now that Fortet had put out his first straight microhouse project with Pink, and it seemed to go over pretty well, he decided for the next project he was gonna strip things down even further, delve even more into super straightforward and simplistic house arrangements, even take a bit of influence from the ongoing grime and UK garage scenes, as well as pirate radio, and have that influence some of the sample choices. And with an album rollout that was just as low-key to match it, advertising it is just gonna come out, no pre-order, no drawn-out album trailers, no Amazon deal, no Bitcoin deal, no last-minute Rick Rubin. It generally seemed to get positive reviews at the time of its release, though it seems to have been like an odd turning point for him in retrospect, where his fan base is a bit more divided on how much he's really held their interest. Some people stuck by his stuff in this style, and other people started to see him as much less interesting than he used to be. Never again would he put out a project that had a particularly strong consensus from both fans and critics. At least not even close to as strong as those of Rounds and There Is Lovin' You. As for me personally, I remember when I first got into Fortet and was going through his catalog for the first time, this was his most recent album at that point. Had no reason to think this wouldn't at least be really good. I'd enjoyed all his previous projects. And I also remember generally liking it at the time. I remember liking it for, being a change of pace in his catalog, not sounding like any of his other stuff. Though something did seem slightly amiss. It wasn't really sticking out as one of my big favorites in his catalog. And this was also kind of a weird one to come back to as well. First return listen, I was pretty well sold on it. But as I've continually come back to it over these past couple of weeks, pretty much any enthusiasm I had in it initially dried up. And I gotta say, it's really started to stick out as one of the single weakest projects he's put out. Might even be his worst studio album overall. Well, it'd be close between this and his last album, Parallel. That album was just redundant and sounded like he was throwing together a bunch of ideas that he'd already done several times before, but not as good this time around. There are a few aspects of Beautiful Rewind that I prefer over that project. It does get points for being a more unique entrant in his catalog with, the pirate radio samples. I don't know if they're actually from pirate radio, or whatever. The more rough and ragged presentation, as well as still being his shortest studio album so far. And also coming from the era in which Microhouse Fortet was still a novelty, before it had really been established that this just was the formula he was gonna stick to. And I also know well from hearing some of his live sets that these tracks do go over surprisingly really well in that live setting. He often uses these tracks as like transitional elements and mashing them up with his similar material in this vein, and he'll totally kill it. The more simplistic construction of these tracks makes them all the more well suited to being chopped up and mashed up with his other material in live sets. But then I started to think about that as well, since that was the element of his New Energy album that got that album to finally click with me a solid year after that dropped. Then I looked back on this one and I thought, no, this isn't really the same as that, though. The knowledge that he kills these tracks live didn't make the studio versions better in the same way it did for New Energy, because these studio versions are super scant and skeletal. In this context, they feel like a bunch of disparate transitional elements for DJ sets, but without any real attempt to connect them together. They're just kind of sitting there out in the open. Well, okay, that's not always the case. There are still quite a few tracks that still hold up and stand on their own in spite of everything, but yeah, as a whole, this album is at best a giant mixed bag that feels pretty underdeveloped across the board. Now, I will give this thing credit for the whole first half. There's a lot of solid stuff here, like the opener Gong. That's a consistent favorite with its dense storm cloud of thumping percussion textures, with a little snippet of MC and female voice being a nice touch on top of that. Sounds totally different from both the rest of the album and anything else that comes to mind in the Fortet catalog. The whole mix seems very foggy and blurry, but still delivering an organic groove that works quite well. Parallel Jalebi, meanwhile, totally contrasts that track with super clean, stuttered synth notes and airy female vocal snippets looped and layered in the usual Fortet way. It's one of those tracks that I like more for how it fits into live sets than the kind of track I actively seek out of context. Fortet does have a ton of other tracks that sound almost exactly like this, especially his track Planet, which came out after this, but whatever. But it does still work in the way it's intended and stood out as a highlight anytime I put this project on. The track Our Navigation is a grower. It starts out with another very simple beat and low-key vocal snippet loop as usual, but slowly getting overtaken by a load of blipping synth textures covered in reverb, and darkening the whole mix in a pretty neat way. And that makes for a nice contrast to Ba Teaches Yoga, the lightest and most refreshing sounding track in the bunch. Has pretty much all the same sonic ingredients as Our Navigation, mostly loads of ambient synth licks layered over each other, and another female vocal snippet saying, "Come on, come on, come on." But it feels so much warmer and more comforting than any other track here. The way it's so consistently hit for me, and remembering how he used it to transition into his track 2017 in his Live at Funkhaus Berlin set, and being one of the best moments of that whole concert gave it a further extra boost. But I would still only mark it as my second favorite cut here, behind following track, Kool FM. I mean, Ba Teaches Yoga, that still feels like a transitional element, if an excellent one that never really got old. But Kool FM is pretty much the only track here that feels like it could be designed as the centerpiece of a DJ set. The only one that I legit get excited to hear. It may mostly also be very simple and straightforward minimal house beats with a few wubbing bass licks. But of course this track gets most of its power through this gruff sample of this one MC going, "Hey, hey, hey," followed by this badass DJ scratching. It has a lot of visceral punch to it that I rarely get out of Fortet tracks, and once again, just showing the power you can get out of such simplistic arrangements, it's a legit banger. Just, kind of a shame then that the rest of this album can't compete with it. Unfortunately, after this point, I felt like the album noticeably fell off for me and stopped pulling in my attention, starting to show how going so simplistic isn't always a good thing. If the elements you're working with aren't that compelling, then I just get checked out and bored. Crush delivers a load of cascading synth licks that quickly speed up and slow down. It's cool enough, I guess, but it's mostly just kind of jerky and not in a particularly interesting way. Ends up feeling like an interlude, even though it's not really that much shorter than the regular tracks on here. Brew Club feels like a bunch of random ideas thrown haphazardly onto a house beat, with the sample of the MC that sounds like it's saying the title in the beginning does not match at all with the looped female vocal snippets being switched over to later. Also, these snippets themselves even sound kind of bored and checked out through their delivery. I mean, a track like Parallel Jalebi may have been basic as hell, but at least those vocal snippets sounded more invested than this, and complemented the groove they were on a lot better. Aerial, meanwhile, falls short for near opposite reasons. This was a track I wanted to mark as a favorite initially, given it's the longest track here, and its mix of bright synth flicks and shuffling percussion feels a lot better layered and detailed than most tracks on here. But there's not enough progression to this one to really stick the landing. The mix grew too repetitive and stale. The kind of track where I could get pulled in initially, but I just wouldn't stay pulled in for the whole time. Brukla may have felt shoddy and thrown together, but it did change over time and felt like it was going somewhere. Now, after your prototypical Fortet barely existing interlude in Ever Never, the last two tracks are a little better. I'll even say Unicorn is the strongest cut of the whole back half, in the way it got all its glittering melodic synths to come together, sort of had a mood-brightening effect similar to Ba Teaches Yoga, but not as consistently effective as that one. Wasn't so effective that it always stuck out to me, but I can at least mark it as one of the better cuts. And the closer, Your Body Feels, that's another track I really want to like more than I do. I really like the use of all these horns and trumpets in the mix, and they feel bright and uplifting and give this track some unique texture, but that vocal sample running through most of it was pretty annoying and repetitive, ended up kind of canceling out the track's better qualities. Your body feels, your body feels. Sounds like it was talking about porta potties on some listens, I swear. But yeah, that's everything on Beautiful Rewind. An album that definitely has some good material, I did still like returning to, but also exemplifies a lot of things that I think people don't really care for in Fortet's work. The way it is just so simple and stripped back, but only sometimes has compelling enough ideas to justify the sparseness, and can end up feeling rather boring and dry in its worst moments. And as a whole, while it does have an identity in his catalog and some ideas on sequencing that can let it feel like a more cohesive whole than it might initially let on, it also feels very thrown together compared to many of his other projects. I don't think it'd be fair to write it off entirely. It's hardly an unpleasant listen, or anything that I couldn't get anything out of. And sitting with his project more and letting these tracks stick in my mind more is going to further improve his live stats for me, as I can point to tracks and say, oh, I know that one, that's Parallel Jalebi, or oh, I know that one, that's Bot Teaches Yoga, that's cool. Oh, that's Kool FM, hell yeah. But on its own, in this regular studio context, this one just feels less and less essential as the years go by, and he further improved upon these kinds of formulas. I mean, it's a serviceable album that's fun to put on sometimes. I don't plan on deleting it off my iPod, and it's entirely possible I'm missing something from here as an American who obviously has no experience with UK pirate radio, but it just shrunk on me the more and more I listened to it, and if a project like this was your primary exposure to Fortet, and it led you to seeing him as overrated, I might be able to see why. So, yeah, 6.3 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.